And we welcome you back to America's Forum. I'm John Bachman, filling in for J.D. Hayworth today. Well, jurors are set to begin deliberations in the Boston Marathon bombing trial. The trial falling on late-night comedian Bill Maher's radar. Take a listen.
I think after everything we've been through, I at least deserve the common respect of being told face to face. Just tell me two things, Zane. Which one in the band were you? And where were you during the Boston Marathon?
And there you hear the reaction from the crowd. Maybe a little too soon for jokes about the Boston Marathon bomber Dzhokhar Tsarnaev. Bill Maher comparing him to a member of the boy band One Direction. Let's bring in our panel, Stephen Cobb, who is a big One Direction fan. He's also a former general counsel for the Democratic Party of Virginia. And Larry Elder, I should say, who's more of a New Kids on the Block guy, right, Larry?
That's right.
All right, well, guys, let's start with Bill Maher. You heard his crowd, who often applauds his comments, saying maybe you went a little too far with that joke. Stephen, do you agree?
I do. For better or worse, I think most professional comedians will say that no joke is out of bounds. But I'm personally of the opinion that just because you can make a joke doesn't mean you should make a joke. And I think this fits into the latter, making jokes about the tragedy in Boston and comparing somebody to a alleged terrorist, I think is beyond the pale. And my guess is this is something that Larry and I agree on.
Well, Larry, this stings too because of what Rolling Stone did with Dzhokhar Tsarnaev initially, putting him on the cover just like he was any other rock star. And he also had that following of young female fans who were waiting for him out in front of the courtroom. I mean, you got to know, I mean, a comedian is a comedian, but he does have a current events, political kind of themed show. Did he go too far?
Well, consider the source. We're talking about Bill Maher here. He's a guy that said the reason George W. Bush responded so sluggishly to Hurricane Katrina was because New Orleans is French and sexy and black, whatever the hell that means. His audience laughed, so I assume mission accomplished. He said also pretty offensive things about Sarah Palin, about Michelle Bachmann, for which he's gotten a pass. So I just put him in a little box and I kind of ignore him.
Yeah, I guess we're getting what we would expect from Bill Maher. Let's move on, guys, and talk about the big news today on the campaign trail. Rand Paul is now out saying he's running for president in 2016. He is out there, Stephen, on some of these issues, but he has tried to reach across racial lines, socioeconomic lines, things like this prison reform thing he's working on with Senator Cory Booker, also his stance on drugs. Do you think Rand Paul is going to win over some Reagan Democrats?
I don't. I think it's going to be a very interesting campaign to see how he fits into the Republican field. I think he's kind of taken numerous views on numerous issues, whether that's the Civil Rights Act, whether that's the use of drones, whether that's immigration. There's been a lot of, for lack of a better word, flip-flopping on some of these issues and where he really stands. I think some of his counterparts in the Republican primary are going to take him to task for that, and it'll be easy to see how those issues flush out in Iowa and elsewhere. But I think it's going to make for an interesting dialogue between Senator Paul and some of the other members of the Republican primary.
Larry, I want to quickly get your take on this clip that he released over the weekend, Rand Paul, before his announcement came. I think we have that clip ready. Let's take a listen. Okay, we don't have it yet. You know, there was a lot of chanting in the background. These candidates seem to be rolling out these candidacies before they actually make the announcement. This strategy that everybody seems to be taking, do you like it, or would you rather just see one announcement?
Well, I'm not sure there's any particular way of doing it. I think Rand Paul's problem is libertarianism. It scares people. If Rand Paul is truly going to stick to his libertarian principles, he'd be saying things like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, or assault on the Constitution. We need to get out from under those kinds of things. And as far as Republicans are concerned, his problem is he's made the same kind of attack against the war in Iraq that you hear, as I mentioned before, from somebody like Dennis Kucinich. He blamed it on Dick Cheney pursuing Halliburton. That's not going to resonate very well with Republicans.
No, certainly not. Stephen, what do you think? I mean, Rand Paul was trying to reach a wider audience here, but the attitudes towards this isolationism seems to have changed.
Well, I think Larry hit the nail on the head there. I think he's going to have some serious problem with some of those prior stances. I mean, he's talked about ending foreign aid to Israel. He's backed off that a bit recently, but I think that's going to put him at odds with a lot of Republicans in the primary and a lot of Democrats too. And so, I mean, that he's kind of on an island there by himself when it comes to a lot of those foreign policy issues. And it'll be interesting to see how that comes to bear, particularly in those Republican debates, but in the overall discussion of policy issues going forward.
Well, we'll talk a little bit more about libertarianism in a second, guys. I don't want to cut anybody off again. We've got to get ready for this commercial break. We're having you both back. We'll continue our conversation. We'll talk also a little bit more about Rand Paul's foreign policy, but also more about his domestic policy and which one's going to play a bigger role in his 2016 run. Larry Elder, Stephen Cobb are back with us right after the short commercial break. John Bachman in for J.D. Hayward today. Our political panel continues right after this short commercial break.
Liberal policies have failed our inner cities.
Liberal policies have failed our inner cities. Fair enough. But what else, Senator Paul? Continue our conversation now with Newsmax contributor Larry Elder, radio and talk show host, also Stephen Cobb, former general counsel for the Democratic Party. Now, Rand Paul has of course, made himself out to be this libertarian candidate following in his father's footsteps. But there is a difficult issue here, Larry, when you try to balance libertarianism and conservatism, and he's trying to do that, but doesn't seem to be doing it very well.
Well, I'm not sure he's all that good of a politician, but it is a difficult thing to pull off. I consider Ronald Reagan to have been both a Republican and a small L libertarian. One of the intellectual lights of the Republican Party is Milton Friedman, who also called him a Republican and a small L libertarian. Again, my problem with Rand Paul on domestic issues, I think he's wonderful, but on foreign policy, he's not as naive as President Obama is. And the idea, by the way, that Steve mentioned of Rand Paul advocating cutting off all aid to Israel, he advocated cutting off all aid to everybody, including Israel, which, in my opinion, is not a bad foreign policy. But it's not something that most people are going to accept. It's going to scare most people, and that's the problem with libertarians. Freedom really scares people, and the isolationist part of Rand Paul's foreign policy agenda scares me.
Well, it scares a lot of folks who are looking out for the interests of Israel, too. Let's also play a clip here from Senator Lindsey Graham, who also might jump in this race at some point, talking about Rand Paul's foreign policy.
If Rand Paul's the nominee of the party, I will support them. But Rand Paul was the one senator, Greta, that voted against my resolution 2 years ago saying that we will not allow Iran to get a nuclear capability and contain them. I think it would be a lousy idea to give them a nuclear weapon and hope you could contain them. 90 senators agreed with me. The one senator who opposed this resolution was Rand Paul.
Well, Rand Paul was also seen when Benjamin Netanyahu was here at Congress clapping less than wholeheartedly. At least that was what some of the pundits were saying. And, you know, it doesn't seem like he really is vested in the future of Israel as some in his party are. Stephen, what do you think? Is this a chink in the armor for Rand Paul?
Well, I think as I alluded to earlier, I think he's really going to hit a headwind with some of his opponents in the Republican primary. And I think Lindsey Graham is a great example of that. I think Lindsey Graham is going to take him to the woodshed when it comes to a foreign policy discussion. That is Lindsey Graham's wheelhouse, and I think he's going to point out every single way in which Senator Paul does not agree with mainstream America and foreign policy and supporting our ally Israel and supporting, as Larry alluded to earlier, all those countries with whom we give international support.
And Stephen, also, how telling is it for you that Chuck Schumer has now come out saying that he wants some sort of review process for Congress in this Iranian deal?
Well, I mean, I think that's clearly going to be a sentiment shared by
Does that tell us anything about the
Senate.
mindset of other Democrats in the Senate?
I think it does. I mean, I don't think that the Democratic caucus is willing to give up that sort of oversight, and I think there's an understanding that getting that buy-in further would reinforce any potential deal that comes down the pike. And I think that's going to be a continuing dialogue, and I imagine that the senators and their staffs are in constant communication with the White House and the State Department to try and figure out exactly what those next steps are.
Well, Larry, Senator Mike Lee told us earlier here on America's Forum that he believes that there are close to 13 senators, Democratic senators, who would be willing to go along with Republicans and come up with either a bill that would require congressional approval or review, or having a veto-proof majority to put in the president's face and say, do whatever you want, Mr. President, we will block you.
John, they've read the polls. Most Americans don't trust this deal. Most Americans believe that the Iranians will cheat. Most Americans believe that this deal has paved a path towards a bomb. These Democrats have picked up the Washington Post, and they've read the polls, and they've reacted accordingly. That's all.
Just like the president, they're getting their information from the news. Stephen, go ahead.
Point out here, Larry, in the
we got about 20
polls,
seconds.
It said the majority of Americans are in favor of finding a diplomatic solution. And so
they also
when it
believe
comes
that Iran's going to cheat.
Making sure that there is a good deal and a workable deal, I think overwhelmingly those same polls show that the Americans support that and the president's efforts to get that done.
Well, we'll see what happens, gentlemen, between now and June. We got to say goodbye to Stephen. Larry's going to be back with us. We're having more of our conversation ahead. We'll be right back. America's Forum continues after this commercial break.